In the autumn of 1967, an entire Maryland bamboo grove flowered overnight, then died. Stay with me. The trigger had nothing to do with the soil, the weather, or anything happening that year in Maryland at all. The grove had stood for decades, a green wall of canes that never once produced a flower. Then, over a single season, every stem pushed out feathery blossoms, set seed, and turned brown. The caretakers assumed it was disease, or frost, or some mistake in the watering. They cut the dead canes and waited for the roots to send up fresh shoots. But what unsettled the botanists who later read the reports was not the death itself. It was the timing. Because that same autumn, in a botanical garden outside London, another bamboo grove was doing exactly the same thing. So were groves in Alabama, in Russia, in the hills above a town in Japan. Plants separated by oceans, growing in wildly different climates, had all chosen the same year to bloom and die. No storm crossed all those borders. No signal passed between them, and yet they kept perfect time. What follows is the story of the people who tried to explain it, and the answer they found hiding inside the plant itself. The place to start is not Maryland, but Japan, more than a century earlier. The bamboo in that Maryland grove was Japanese timber bamboo, one of the tallest, hardest canes in the world, prized for scaffolding, flutes, and fishing poles. In the 1800s, gardeners and traders began shipping pieces of it abroad. They rarely sent seeds. Instead, they cut living rhizomes, the thick underground stems, and packed them in crates bound for Europe and America. Each cutting took root and spread, sending up canes that looked like a forest but were really one plant, copying itself underground, year after year. A grove of this bamboo is not a population. It is a single individual cloned across acres. That detail matters, and what happens by the end of this story is the part no one expects. For now, hold on to one fact. Every grove of Japanese timber bamboo scattered across the world had been carved, ultimately, from the same few parent plants back in Japan. They were not relatives. They were the same organism, divided and shipped to opposite ends of the earth. For decades they grew in silence, green and identical and apparently immortal. No one thought to ask whether a plant that had been cut apart and mailed across the planet might still, somehow, be keeping the same time. The people who finally noticed were not on an expedition into a jungle. They were botanists and plant physiologists sitting in herbaria, surrounded by pressed flowers and yellowing field notes. Their tools were letters, dried specimens glued to paper, and dates, endless dates, recorded by gardeners who had no idea their scribbled notes would one day be evidence. One researcher began collecting every account he could find of this bamboo flowering, going back as far as the records reached. He wrote to gardens in different countries, asking a simple question: when did your grove last bloom? The answers, laid side by side, formed a pattern no one had expected. The blooms were not random. They clustered. Groves on different continents flowered within the same narrow window, then nothing for a very long time. Chinese records of these events stretched back more than 1,000 years, and even those old accounts seemed to fall into a rhythm. The interval kept landing near the same figure, a cycle of roughly 120 years between flowerings. A plant that blooms once in 12 decades is almost impossible to study on purpose. A single scientist might see one event in a lifetime, if they were lucky, so they did the only thing they could. They read the dead botanist's notes, and they started to count. Bamboo doesn't bloom like other plants. A whole grove flowers the same year, then dies. That was the clue the records kept circling, and it was the one that should not have been possible. When the botanists plotted the flowering dates of Japanese timber bamboo, known to science as Philostachys bambusoides, the readings did not fit any environmental cause. A grove in cool, damp England flowered the same year as a grove in hot, dry Alabama. Drought could not explain it. One site had rain and the other did not. Temperature could not explain it. The climates were nothing alike. Day length could not explain it. The latitudes differed by thousands of miles. Every external trigger a botanist could name was ruled out, one by one, because the plants ignored all of them and bloomed together anyway. It was as if each grove carried an alarm clock set before it ever left Japan, and the clock did not care where the plant had been carried or what the weather was doing when it rang. The more carefully they checked, the stranger it became. These were not plants reacting to their world. They were plants reading something inside themselves, and every copy of the same plant was reading the same number. The obstacle was time itself. To prove a plant kept a 120-year clock, you would have to watch it for 120 years, longer than any career, longer than most lives. Skeptics had an easy escape. They argued the synchrony was a coincidence, or that some shared weather pattern, some hidden environmental cue, must be sweeping across continents unnoticed. The internal clock idea sounded almost mystical, and science is rightly suspicious of the mystical. There was also a darker complication. In the hills of northeast India, a different bamboo flowered on its own schedule, roughly every 48 years, and when it did, the consequences were catastrophic for people. The seeds fell in such enormous quantities that rats swarmed in to eat them, bred explosively, and then, when the seed ran out, poured into villages and devoured the crops. The result was famine, a disaster the locals had named and feared for generations. The bamboo clock was not an abstraction there. It was a countdown to hunger. For a while, all of this noise, the skeptics, the famines, the sheer impossibility of waiting out a 120-year cycle, buried the simple question underneath. Was the clock real, and was it inside the plant? The answer would not come from waiting. It would come from an accident of geography that no one had set up on purpose. One bamboo plant was cut apart and shipped worldwide, and every piece flowered the same year. This was the accident that settled it. Because all those scattered groves had been propagated from the same original plants, botanists were not comparing different bamboos at all. They were watching a single individual that had been sliced into pieces and mailed to 4 continents. And then, decades later, watching every piece do the same thing at the same moment. The grove that bloomed and died in Maryland was not reacting to anything in Maryland. It was obeying a count that had begun long before, in Japan, when it was still part of one plant. Slow this down, because it is the whole story. A cutting taken in the 1800s carries an internal calendar. You ship it 10,000 miles, planted in a different hemisphere, a different soil, a different sky. It grows for over a century, ignoring every season's signal to flower. And then, in a year it seems to have known all along, it blooms, sets seed, and dies, in lockstep with siblings it has never touched, on land it has never seen. There was no signal between them. There never needed to be. Each copy was simply running the same clock, started at the same instant, ticking down to the same year. What that discovery changed was how botanists thought about plants and time. A bamboo grove is not a crowd of individuals responding to the weather. It is one organism running a clock so long that no single human can watch it tick from start to finish. The flowering that swept the world in the 1960s and 1970s has since faded into memory, and the new groves grown from that seed are now decades into their own count, quietly heading toward a bloom their planters will likely never see. In northeast India, the famine clock keeps running too. The rats will return on schedule, whether or not anyone is ready. We tend to imagine plants as passive, shaped entirely by sun and rain and soil. But this one carries a number inside it, set before it was ever divided, kept faithfully across oceans and centuries. The grove flowers when the clock says so, and nothing we do can move the hands.